There are things a man does not because he has to, not because he was told to, but because something deep inside him shifts when he meets a woman who awakens his truth. These 9 things, they're not about love songs or flowers. They're signals, silent declarations of an inner transformation that only a rare kind of woman can initiate. 1. He becomes intentional with his silence. He no longer escapes into distractions. He embraces stillness, because her presence makes solitude meaningful. 2. He starts confronting his shadows, not because she demands it, but because being with her requires honesty he can't fake. She holds up a mirror, and he stops running. 3. He protects her peace, even from himself. He begins to watch his words, his tone, his energy, not out of fear, but reverence. He refuses to be the storm in her soul. 4. He sacrifices without seeking praise. He gives time, energy, attention, but says nothing. To the world, it's invisible. To her, it's everything. This is the quiet service of a real man. 5. He invites her into his inner world. Not the curated version, the raw, unfiltered one. His wounds, his dreams, his doubts. He trusts her with the map to his soul. 6. He listens, not to respond, but to absorb. Because her words carry symbols, her emotions are sacred data. He listens with the ears of a man who seeks to understand, not fix. 7. He changes patterns built over decades. A man can live the same way for 30 years, but for her, he rewrites habit. He evolves. He doesn't become someone else. He becomes himself. 8. He shares power instead of control. He doesn't need to dominate or lead blindly. He honors her voice. He lets her influence him, because only fools resist wisdom. 9. He chooses her again and again. Not when it's easy, not when it's perfect, but in the tension, the friction, the chaos, he stays. And that choice, that's devotion, not convenience. Most people never see these things, because they look for noise, for performance. But the strongest signals of love live in quiet rituals of respect and soulful effort. If you're that 1%, you'll recognize them. And if you're the woman he does these things for, know this: you are not just loved, you are sacred. A man's love reveals his path toward inner transformation. It is not merely affection or desire, it is the cracking open of a long-guarded vault deep within his psyche. When a man truly loves, not for validation or conquest, but because something within him is stirred by the presence of a particular woman, that love becomes a catalyst. It pulls at the very architecture of his identity. The armor he wore for years begins to rust. The masks slip. His routines start to feel too small. He doesn't understand it at first, but he feels it. A silent urgency. A calling, not from her lips, but from within his own soul. It's as though something ancient has been waiting for this moment to rise, and it does so through her. This love isn't weak or soft. It is fierce and dismantling. It is the kind that forces a man to reckon with every wound he thought he'd buried. She becomes the spark that brings light to the rooms he kept locked. And not because she's trying to fix him, she doesn't need to. Her very existence touches a hidden code in his being that says, evolve or lose something irreplaceable. That's what most never understand. When a man truly loves a woman who is aligned with his soul, he doesn't become less of himself. He becomes more. He becomes the version he glimpsed only in dreams and feared he would never touch in waking life. He begins to observe his own behaviors with new eyes. Not because she nags or demands change, but because her presence reveals contrast. His chaos next to her peace, his avoidance next to her truth, his hesitation next to her clarity. And something inside him shifts. He starts to hold himself accountable in ways he never did before. Not out of shame, but out of reverence. She is not his therapist. She is not his savior. She is the rare mirror that reflects both his current state and the man he could be. And that mirror does not lie. A man on the path of real love becomes uncomfortable with mediocrity. He begins to detach from the distractions that once sedated him, the noise of shallow attention, the pride in performance, the need to dominate or win. These begin to lose their flavor. Because this kind of woman, this rare one, calls out something ancient and noble, not through lectures, not through manipulation, but through the way she is. She speaks in the quiet power of integrity. She carries mystery, not confusion. She doesn't demand loyalty, she evokes it. And for her, the man sheds layers of ego that no battle could ever remove. He starts facing things, old fears, hidden guilt, the unfinished conversations with his own past. He realizes that to truly love her, he must become whole, not perfect but integrated. That is the work. That is the silent labor that no one sees. The late nights where he rewrites his own beliefs. The mornings where he chooses discipline over numbness. The moments where he steps back from his impulse to dominate, control, or withdraw, and instead moves closer. Not because it's easy, but because it's right. Because walking away from her would mean walking away from the one door that led him back to himself. This kind of love isn't built on fantasy. It is not blind. It sees the flaws, the trauma, the mess. And still, it says yes. But that yes is not passive. It is an active, burning commitment. A vow that begins not with promises, but with presence. He shows up, and he keeps showing up. Even when he fails. Especially when he fails. Because he knows now that failure is not the end. It's a signal, a call to refine. And through her, he has found the courage to answer that call. He begins to protect her peace. Not to impress her, but because he understands that her peace is rare and it must be guarded. He doesn't speak to overpower, he speaks to align. His masculinity no longer needs to shout, it simply is. Rooted, grounded, directed. He begins to sacrifice, not as a transaction but as an offering. Quiet acts of devotion that no one else will ever applaud, but she will feel them in her bones. He changes, not who he is, but how deeply he lives in alignment with who he was meant to be. In her presence, he begins to speak truthfully. He no longer fears emotional exposure. Vulnerability becomes not a weakness but a discipline. He knows now that hiding weakens love. And love, real love, deserves the full truth. So he gives it. Hesitantly at first, but with growing strength. And when she listens, not to judge but to understand, he feels something crack open in his chest. And for the first time, perhaps in his entire life, he feels seen. Not for what he performs, but for what he carries. This is the transformation. This is what only 1% of people will ever notice. The deep work a man does, not loudly, not publicly, but in the private hours of his evolution. He does it because she awakens something in him that no one else ever touched. Not lust, not obsession, but remembrance. The memory of who he could be, buried beneath years of survival. And now, because of her, he walks toward that version of himself with steady, silent steps, not for reward, not for applause, but because for the first time in his life he finally knows where he's going. Only a woman who resonates with his soul can awaken his unconscious devotion. Not the kind of woman who fits a checklist, not the one who pleases his senses, but the one who strikes a note in the very core of his being, one that he didn't even know was there. Her presence is not loud, but it is unmistakable. She doesn't enter his life like a storm, she arrives like a key, and without even trying, she unlocks doors he had long forgotten existed. He can't explain it, but something in her gaze bypasses the surface and goes straight to the parts of him he's never shown the world. She doesn't just attract him, she calls him, and without realizing it he begins to answer, not with words, but with change. In her presence, he starts to notice the gap between the man he presents and the man he truly is. That space, once comfortably ignored, becomes impossible to unsee. Her energy doesn't demand anything of him, yet it demands everything from him. She evokes his higher self by simply existing in her truth. There's no manipulation, no emotional games. She just is. And in that authenticity, she activates something ancient, something sacred. He doesn't fall in love with her beauty, although she may have it. He doesn't commit because of compatibility, although it might be there. He moves toward her because his soul recognizes her as something essential to his becoming. And this knowing is not logical. It is instinctual. He doesn't plan his devotion. It begins to form quietly, beneath the noise of his thoughts. In subtle shifts, in changed reactions, in deeper silences, he starts listening more, not just to her voice, but to her essence. Her presence becomes a compass, an invisible guide pointing to what must be healed, what must be released, what must be faced. She doesn't give him a map, she doesn't try to lead. But somehow, through her alignment with herself, she leads him back to his own alignment. It is this spiritual mirror that moves him, even when he resists. For most of his life, he may have avoided depth. He may have lived in the mind, in survival, in detachment. But this woman brings him into contact with something that burns clean through those defenses. She doesn't attack them, she simply sees past them. Her eyes don't just look at him, they see him. They reflect back the truth he's been too afraid to touch. And something in him starts to awaken, slowly at first, then undeniably. The things he once thought mattered begin to lose meaning. The distractions that once satisfied begin to feel hollow, and what grows in their place is a hunger, not for possession but for presence. He finds himself wanting to understand her, not to analyze or control, but to witness. Her complexity doesn't confuse him, it challenges him. Her strength doesn't intimidate him, it anchors him. Her softness doesn't make him feel superior, it makes him protective. But this protection is not of the old kind. It is not dominance, not ownership, not force. It is the quiet strength of a man who realizes that her soul is not his to capture but his to honor. And in that realization, he shifts from pursuit to presence, from seeking to seeing, from performance to authenticity. He may not even be aware of the devotion growing inside him. It won't come with fireworks or declarations. It will come in the form of small, sacred actions. The way he listens differently. The way he begins to correct himself without being asked. The way he prioritizes peace over ego. The way he chooses integrity even when no one's watching. These are not things he does for every woman. These are not acts of obligation. These are unconscious offerings born from the recognition that this woman is not like the others. She has not touched his life, she has touched his being. And yet, this is not about idealizing her. She is not flawless. She is not perfect. She is simply true. And in a world full of noise and illusion, truth feels like magic. It's not her job to maintain his devotion. It's not her responsibility to keep him inspired. Her only role is to stay aligned with her essence. And when she does, the right man, this man, will meet her with a kind of loyalty that cannot be bought, forced, or negotiated. Because when a woman meets a man's soul before she meets his ego, something irreversible occurs. She doesn't rescue him, but she awakens his desire to rescue himself. She doesn't fix him, but she makes him want to be whole. And in that space, something sacred forms, not a fairy tale, not a fantasy, but a bond forged in the unseen places, a devotion that doesn't show up in public performances, but in private, daily choices, in the way he protects her name when she's not in the room, in the way he shows up on the days when it's hardest, in the way he rewrites the narrative of his life, not because she asked him to, but because her presence made him realize the old story no longer fits. Most will never understand this. Most won't see it. They'll see the gestures but miss the meaning. They'll hear the words but not feel the frequency. Because what's happening here lives beneath the surface. This is not about romance. This is not about chemistry. This is about soul recognition, about a man who never thought he would be capable of devotion, realizing he already is. He just hadn't met the one who made him remember. The 9 acts are not romantic gestures. They're sacred symbols of masculine surrender. They do not come wrapped in roses or choreographed words. They are not meant to impress, seduce, or earn affection. They emerge from a man in the quiet, unguarded moments, when his soul recognizes something holy in the presence of a woman who mirrors back his truth. These acts are not calculated. They are not part of a strategy. They arise instinctively, without conscious intention, and they cost him something internal: pride, control, comfort, ego. That is what makes them sacred. He is not giving her a performance. He is giving her something of himself that cannot be faked or forced. These are not the moves of a man trying to win. These are the offerings of a man who has already been moved. In a world where masculinity is often defined by dominant speed and conquest, these acts signal something deeper: release. They mark the moment where a man no longer needs to dominate to feel strong, no longer needs to hide to feel safe, no longer needs to prove to feel worthy. In her presence he surrenders, not to her will, but to the unfamiliar terrain of his own depth. She doesn't command it. She doesn't demand it. She simply evokes it. Her energy speaks a language that bypasses his defenses. Her silence is louder than a crowd. Her truth is sharper than logic. And something within him, something ancient and unspoken, kneels. This surrender is not weakness. It is power directed inward. It is the courage to feel, to admit, to soften. It is what separates a man who is merely experienced from one who is transformed. These acts are not gifts meant for the world to applaud. They are rites of passage. Each one strips away something false. Each one carves out space for something real, and no one may ever notice. That's the point. These symbols are invisible to the crowd, but to the woman who holds space for him, not as a reward, not as a possession, but as a reflection, they mean everything. The first of these acts is his silence, not the silence of disconnection or punishment, but the sacred stillness of presence. In a world that teaches him to fill space with noise, he chooses quiet. He listens, not just to her words, but to her emotions, her energy, her pauses. He does not rush to fix or interrupt. He allows himself to be impacted. He allows her inner world to shape his awareness. This is not passive. This is deliberate vulnerability. This is a man making room inside himself for another person's truth. The second act is self-correction. Without being told, without being shamed, he begins to shift his behavior. Not to avoid conflict, but because something in him refuses to bring harm into her space. Her peace becomes a standard he holds himself to. He becomes more mindful, more measured, not because he's pretending, but because her presence awakens a level of responsibility that feels spiritual. He knows that to stay near her energy, he must become someone worthy of it. The third act is sacrifice, not the kind that demands recognition. He gives up patterns, distractions, and habits that serve the old version of him, the one who didn't need to feel deeply. He detaches from what once numbed him, even when it hurts, because he knows real connection requires his wholeness. She never asks him to do this. She never puts conditions on love, but his devotion expresses itself through what he's willing to lay down. That is not romance, that is surrender. The fourth act is presence in conflict. He stays when it's uncomfortable. He remains when his instincts scream to flee. He breathes instead of blaming. He listens instead of lashing out. Not because he's weak, but because he refuses to make her his battlefield. Her strength gives him no excuse to be reckless. His respect shows itself in how he holds her pain, not as a burden, but as a privilege. He becomes a container, not a hammer. The fifth act is transparency. Not performative honesty, but deep, bone-level truth. He tells her things that strip him bare. He admits what he fears, where he's been, what he's failed at. He reveals the parts of himself that he has never shared, not even with himself. And he does so not to gain sympathy, but because hiding feels like betrayal. He realizes that if he wants to be known, truly known, he must risk being seen. And she is the first who makes that risk feel safe. The sixth act is protection, not just physical, but emotional, spiritual, energetic. He shields her not from life, but from the carelessness that once lived in him. He guards her dreams, her softness, her silence. He does not allow the outside world to contaminate her sanctuary. He becomes the buffer between her and harm, not because she is fragile, but because she is precious. His devotion is measured by the gentleness with which he holds her strength. The seventh act is reorientation. He shifts his direction, his priorities, his focus, not to orbit her, but to align with what they are building. His decisions now consider more than himself. He doesn't lose his mission, he expands it. His vision evolves to include her, not as an accessory, but as a catalyst. Her influence reshapes his inner compass, not by control, but by clarity. The eighth act is reverence. He does not idolize her. He honors her. He recognizes her not as perfect, but as profoundly real. He pays attention to her patterns, her wounds, her desires. He learns her language, not the surface one, but the symbolic one. And he speaks to her in the way only a man who has surrendered ego can, through consistent, grounded care. The ninth act is choice. He chooses her again and again, not when it's easy, not when she's convenient, but in the spaces where uncertainty lives. He does not stay because of comfort. He stays because of alignment. Because every time life offers him a reason to disconnect, his soul reminds him, this isn't just love. This is the woman who awakened everything. The special woman is not perfect, but she evokes truth. She does not hide behind illusions of flawlessness, nor does she seek to be seen as something ideal. Her power lies not in being without fault, but in being relentlessly real. She does not perform, she exists. And in that existence, she confronts the world and the man before her with a level of honesty that strips away all pretenses. She does not need to speak loudly to be heard. Her silence has gravity. Her presence carries a frequency that cuts through the noise, through the roles, through the masks, and lands directly in the space where the soul lives. She is not trying to awaken anyone, but her essence makes it impossible to sleep. Around her the air feels different. Not always easy, not always soft, but always undeniable. She does not flatter the ego, she speaks to the essence. She does not nurture comfort for comfort's sake, but reveals where growth is waiting to be claimed. She is not chaotic, but she will not shrink herself to make anyone feel safe in their stagnation. Her truth unsettles those who live on the surface, and yet, for a man ready to evolve, she feels like home. Not the home filled with distraction and false security, but the home that reminds him of who he truly is and what he's capable of becoming. Her truth is not a weapon, but it is not tame. It demands presence. It demands depth. It demands that he put down the shield and meet her with his bare hands, his bare heart. She does not ask him to be more. She invites him to remember that he already is, and that remembrance hurts before it heals. Because to meet her truth, he must first face where he's been dishonest with himself. She reflects what he is and what he has the potential to be all at once, not through judgment, but through alignment. Her standards are not rules. They are reflections of the sacred ground she stands on. And when she allows him near, he understands that this is not space to casually occupy. This is not terrain for games or half measures. This is where the real work begins. She evokes his truth not with pressure, but with presence. When she speaks, she doesn't just communicate, she penetrates. Her words carry energy that can't be deflected. She doesn't have time to pretend, and that absence of pretending calls out every false identity he's ever worn. Around her, he becomes aware of every place in his life where he is settled, every lie he told himself to avoid growth, every story he clung to just to avoid being fully seen. She doesn't force these realizations. They emerge simply because she is. She holds her pain without turning it into poison. She holds her power without turning it into performance. She holds her love without demanding it be earned. And that combination breaks him open. Because it's rare, because it's real, and because it touches the part of him he forgot was even alive. She is not impressed by his performance, nor is she intimidated by his silence. She watches how he moves when no one is watching. She listens to what his presence says when his words are polished. And when he realizes that she sees through everything, he is left with only one choice: show up as he is, or walk away from the one place that could hold him without distortion. She is not easy to love, not because she is difficult, but because loving her requires depth. It requires maturity. It requires that he shed every shortcut, every coping mechanism, every mask that he once used to get by. She cannot be fooled, not because she's guarded, but because she's clear. Her clarity acts as a filter. Only what is real remains. And for the man willing to meet that level of reality, she becomes the catalyst for everything he ever hoped to become, but didn't know how to reach. Not because she changes him, but because she reveals what was always there. She doesn't teach through instruction. She teaches through embodiment. Her values are not on her lips. They are in her choices. Her wisdom is not in what she claims to know. It's in how she listens to what is unspoken. She isn't loud with her power, but it echoes. It lingers. Long after she walks away, the memory of her integrity leaves a man different. Because she did not ask him to build her a kingdom, she asked if he had built one within himself, and if he hasn't, he will begin. Not to impress her, but because something in him was touched by the mirror she became. A mirror that didn't flatter, but reflected. A mirror that didn't judge, but revealed. A mirror that didn't distort, but showed him who he really was when everything else fell away. This is the kind of truth she evokes. Not the easy kind, the kind that burns before it liberates, the kind that collapses walls before it rebuilds strength, the kind that calls him not to follow her, but to stand beside her, as an equal, as a partner, as a man who has done the inner work. She is not perfect. She bleeds, she breaks, she cries, she doubts. But even in her imperfection, she remains honest. And that honesty is what makes her sacred. She does not play small to be accepted. She does not dim to be loved. She does not settle to be safe. And in refusing to do so, she reminds the world, and especially him, that truth is not about being right. It is about being real. And for the man brave enough to see her clearly, she will be the woman who changed everything without ever trying to. These actions are not loud. They are quiet, powerful, and often invisible to the untrained eye. They do not come with grand announcements or cinematic moments. They slip into existence with subtlety, disguised as ordinary behavior, yet carrying the weight of something sacred. These are the gestures of a man whose heart has been stirred not by lust, not by fantasy, but by a connection that touches the root of who he is. He does not need to shout his love from rooftops, because he is too busy proving it in ways that most will never notice. His devotion is not a performance. It is a lived truth. And because it is real, it does not need attention to validate its presence. He adjusts his tone mid-sentence when he senses her spirit waver. He pauses before reacting, because he knows that his energy can either build or bruise. He pays attention to the words she doesn't say, the pauses in her speech, the tension behind her smile. He is attuned, not in a desperate way, but in a disciplined one. His awareness is an offering. It says, I see you, not just when you're radiant and glowing, but also when you're quiet and uncertain. And he doesn't say it with words. He says it by how he remains, how he listens, how he holds space without trying to fix her. The untrained eye misses these things because they look too simple. They don't come dressed in spectacle. They come as a hand on the lower back when she walks through a room, as a genuine question about how her soul is doing, not just how her day went, as the willingness to sit in silence next to her sadness instead of talking it away. These moments don't fit the narrative that love must be loud to be deep. But the man who is truly connected to her knows that the strongest roots grow underground, unseen, untouched by applause. He changes his schedule without a show of sacrifice. He lets go of distractions that once ruled his attention, not to prove worth but because they simply no longer compare. He doesn't announce that he's made space for her. She just finds herself there, in the center of his life, without needing to earn it. His priorities shift, but not with resistance. There is no struggle in letting go of shallow when something sacred has entered his life. These changes aren't dramatic, they're integrated. He doesn't broadcast the evolution, he just becomes it. When she speaks, he hears more than her words. He hears her needs beneath her pride, her fears beneath her strength, her dreams tucked behind the silence she carries. He asks the second question, the deeper one, the one that shows he was listening between the lines. He holds her truth gently, like a precious artifact from a world he's only now beginning to understand. He doesn't try to mold her into what's comfortable. He expands himself to meet her where she is. And no one sees this work, no one claps for it. But it builds a bond stronger than any declaration ever could. He doesn't disappear when things get complicated. He doesn't turn cold when she's emotional. He doesn't punish her for being human. Instead, he chooses to stay, not as a prisoner, but as a man who understands that love is forged in friction, not fantasy. His presence during difficulty is not loud, it is steady. He does not dramatize his loyalty. He simply doesn't leave. And while others may see that as expected, it is, in fact, exceptional. Because in a world addicted to escape, staying is a form of rebellion. He remembers the little things, not just birthdays or anniversaries, but the way her eyes shift when she's overwhelmed, the music she plays when she wants to feel safe, the foods that comfort her, the stories she tells with guarded laughter. He collects these pieces of her like sacred data, not to control her, but to understand her, to serve her with quiet precision. He doesn't need a reason to be thoughtful. She is reason enough. There are moments when she feels exhausted, disconnected from herself, burdened by the weight of the world, and in those moments he doesn't try to rescue her. He simply reminds her, through his presence, through his steadiness, through the way he looks at her without flinching, that she is still everything. He doesn't say the perfect words. He becomes the perfect stillness. He allows her to rest without performance, to be raw without fear. And in that quiet holding, he says more than 1,000 romantic gestures ever could. He forgives without making her bleed for it. He trusts without demanding constant reassurance. He honors her boundaries even when they cost him comfort. He chooses integrity over being right. He chooses growth over control. He chooses love even when no one is watching. And none of this looks impressive from the outside. There are no dramatic speeches, no sweeping gestures, just moment after moment of alignment, just choice after choice that whispers, "I'm here, I'm with you, I'm becoming because of you." To the outside world he may look like any other man, but to the woman who sees beneath the surface he is extraordinary, not because he is perfect, but because he does the invisible things that love requires. He doesn't just say he loves her, he proves it in every silent detail, and while the world may never notice, she does. Because real love doesn't need to be shouted, it just needs to be lived, quietly, powerfully, completely. When a man does these things, he is not just choosing her, he is choosing to evolve. He is stepping into a space where love becomes more than connection, more than attraction, more than companionship. He is stepping into transformation, because these acts, subtle, quiet, often unseen, are not just about her. They're about who he must become to love her in a way that is worthy, grounded, and true. He does not do these things to win her. He does them because he cannot meet a woman of that depth and remain the same. Her presence challenges everything stagnant in him. Her truth shakes loose the lies he told himself to stay small. Her energy does not demand improvement, it awakens it. He begins to feel it in the choices that once came easily but now feel hollow. He notices it in the way old habits start to lose their grip. Not because she gives ultimatums, not because she asks him to change, but because he can no longer be careless in the presence of someone who sees him clearly. And it is that vision, that mirror she holds up, that calls him forward. Not with force, but with the kind of gravity that only truth possesses. To stay in her light, he knows he must walk out of his shadow. This is not a sacrifice of self, it is a deep returning to self. She does not want him to become someone else. She wants him to become who he really is beneath the layers of performance, fear, and unconscious living. And he begins to see that the patterns he used to protect himself are now the same patterns that will keep him from experiencing the full depth of her love. So he starts to let go. Slowly, painfully, but intentionally. He lets go of the mask of invulnerability. He lets go of the illusion of control. He lets go of the distractions that once numbed the ache of unrealized potential. He begins showing up in ways he never did before, not because she expects him to, but because he expects it of himself now. The standard is no longer external. It's internal. She has reminded him of the man he is capable of being, and now the gap between that vision and his current reality feels impossible to ignore. And so he begins the work. Not loudly, not with drama, but in the quiet hours where growth lives, in the space between reaction and reflection, in the moments where he chooses restraint over ego, patience over pride, truth over comfort. Loving her becomes a spiritual act, not because she is perfect or divine, but because she is real, and realness demands presence. He can no longer hide behind shallow intention. He must be precise with his actions, grounded in his choices, awake in his communication. He realizes that to stand beside her, he must be rooted in something deeper than charm or desire. He must have integrity, not just when it's convenient, but especially when it's hard. Not just when she's watching, but when he's alone. This evolution doesn't come all at once. It's not a grand awakening. It's a slow burning away of what no longer serves, a quiet unfolding, a steady internal shift. He starts to notice the way her presence disarms him, softens him, and at the same time strengthens him. She doesn't just challenge his defenses, she gives him a reason to no longer need them, and that is what makes her rare. She doesn't want to take from him, she wants to see him, fully, without distortion, and that kind of seeing requires him to strip away the parts of himself that were built only for survival. He starts taking responsibility for his energy, not just his actions. He becomes more aware of how his silence, his tone, his presence affects her space. He begins to hold her not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. Not because she is fragile, but because she is sacred. And in doing so, he discovers the parts of himself he never accessed in relationships before. The protector, the nurturer, the healer. These roles were always within him, but they remained dormant until he met someone who activated their necessity. And so, every time he chooses her with intention, every time he shows up when it would be easier to run, every time he softens when anger tempts him, every time he honors her boundaries, listens without defense, repairs without resistance, he is not just loving her, he is evolving. He is becoming the kind of man who doesn't need to be reminded of what love requires. He remembers. And that remembering changes how he walks through the world. It changes how he speaks, how he leads, how he creates, how he lives. He may never say it out loud. He may never have the words, but his evolution will speak for him. It will show in the way he no longer settles for shallow connections. It will show in the way he no longer betrays himself to avoid discomfort. It will show in the way he no longer fears intimacy because he has learned that vulnerability is not weakness, it is the path to power. And the woman who helped reveal that path? She may never know just how much she changed his life, but the man he becomes will carry her imprint in every conscious breath, every sacred choice, every quiet moment where he chooses truth over avoidance, presence over performance, and growth over escape. So in the end, it's never about the grand gestures or the loud declarations. It's about the man he becomes in the silence, in the small decisions no one sees, in the way he chooses growth, when comfort calls louder. When a man loves a truly special woman, he doesn't just choose her, he chooses to rise. He chooses to confront himself, to shed what's false, to build what's real. And that choice, made again and again in the quiet of his soul, is the most powerful kind of devotion there is. Because loving her is not just an experience, it is an evolution. And the man who walks that path will never be the same.